It was a peaceful afternoon in the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight from Los Angeles to London. The kind of luxury that made you forget you were 40,000 feet in the air. Plush leather seats, soft lighting, and attendants catering to every need. It was a world of exclusivity, where only the wealthiest and most influential people sat back, sipping champagne and enjoying the finest dining the airline had to offer. Among these first-class passengers sat Calvin Broadus, better known to the world as Snoop Dogg. Snoop wasn't new to this life. He had traveled first class, private jets, and everything in between. But no matter how many flights he took, he always carried the same relaxed energy, chilled back in his seat, shades on, headphones around his neck, sipping on a glass of champagne like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, just cool. Most people in first class that day knew exactly who he was, but they gave him space. After all, this was Snoop Dogg, a legend. You don't just go up to him and start talking nonsense. But there's always one. Enter Richard Lawson. Richard was a high-level executive in a global finance company. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored navy suit, gold watch glinting under the soft cabin lights. He had the look of someone who expected to be the most important person in any room he entered. And the moment he stepped into first class and spotted Snoop Dogg sitting there, a small smirk crept across his face. Richard wasn't a fan of hip-hop. He had never listened to a Snoop Dogg album in his life. To him, Snoop was just another celebrity who had stumbled into success, someone who didn't belong in the same elite space as real professionals. As he walked past, he made sure to slow down, just enough to glance at Snoop, then shake his head dramatically. Snoop, of course, noticed, but he didn't react. He had dealt with people like Richard before, people who judged before they understood. Instead of responding, he just took another sip of his champagne, letting it slide. Richard settled into his seat, which was unfortunately just across the aisle from Snoop's. He placed his leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, adjusted his cufflinks, and sighed loudly, as if disappointed with his surroundings. It didn't take long before the flight attendants started serving drinks. Richard wasted no time ordering himself an expensive whiskey, and as soon as the attendant walked away, he turned his attention back to Snoop. "So," Richard said, his voice carrying just a bit too far. "This is interesting." Snoop slowly turned his head, raising an eyebrow over his dark shades. "What's interesting, homie?" Richard let out a forced chuckle. "I just find it fascinating who they let into first class these days. Used to be all business professionals and CEOs." A few passengers nearby subtly glanced over, sensing the tension brewing. Snoop tilted his head slightly, a smirk forming at the corner of his lips. "And what exactly are you trying to say, big dog?" Richard shrugged, taking a sip of his whiskey. "I mean, no offense, of course, but let's be real. This section is usually for people who run the world. You know, leaders in finance, business, technology. The real power players." Snoop chuckled. Not the kind of chuckle you hear when someone tells a joke, but the kind of chuckle that says, "Oh, you really don't know who you're messing with." "You don't say," Snoop mused, swirling his drink. "Don't get me wrong," Richard continued, oblivious to the shift in energy. "I'm sure what you do is entertaining. But let's be honest, this isn't exactly your crowd, is it?" By now, a few other passengers were paying close attention. Some had their phones out, pretending to scroll, but very much invested in what was about to unfold. Snoop leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the armrest. "Let me ask you something," he said smoothly. "You know how much this seat cost?" Richard smirked. "Well, obviously. A first-class ticket on this flight is upwards of 20 grand. Snoop nodded. Cool. Now let me ask you another thing. Do you know how much I'm worth?" Richard blinked. The smirk faltered. Nah, don't even trip. Let me help you out," Snoop continued, pulling out his phone and casually tapping the screen a few times. "According to Forbes, I'm sitting at around 160 million, and that's just what they think I got." A ripple of amusement spread through the cabin. Someone behind Richard snickered. "Now," Snoop said, leaning back. Tell me how much you worth, big dog. Richard's face turned an impressive shade of pink. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly scrambling for a response. Snoop wasn't done. Matter of fact, he continued, let's talk about business professionals. You ever heard of Death Row Records? Richard frowned. Of course, that gangster rap label from the 90s? Yeah, that gangster rap label now belongs to me. Silence. Snoop adjusted his shades and grinned. See, I don't just rap, homie. I own businesses. I got my own liquor brand. I got my own cannabis company, TV shows, movies, video games. Hell, I even commentate on nature documentaries now. A few passengers chuckled at that. They had seen Snoop's hilarious wildlife narrations, legendary stuff. You ever had a Snoop Dogg wine? Snoop asked, raising his glass. Richard hesitated, then shook his head. Damn shame, Snoop said. 'Cause you know what you drinkin' right now? Richard looked down at his whiskey, suddenly uncertain. That bottle right there? Snoop said, pointing. That's mine. My company helped put that in first class. Richard swallowed hard. He looked at the bottle, then at Snoop, then at the passengers around him, many of whom were now openly grinning. And then, as if the universe had a sense of humor, the flight attendant reappeared. Mr. Broadus, she said with a polite smile, the captain has sent over a special bottle of champagne for you. He's a big fan. Laughter erupted. A few people clapped. Richard turned a deeper shade of red and slumped back in his seat, fully aware that he had just humiliated himself in front of the entire first-class cabin. Snoop, unfazed, raised his glass toward the flight attendant, then turned back to Richard. Next time you want to talk about real power players, he said, make sure you actually know who's running the game. With that, he took a slow sip of champagne, pulled his shades back down, and put on his headphones. Richard, defeated, didn't say another word for the rest of the flight.